Have you ever noticed that everywhere you go in America, one thing is consistent? Every city, county, and state that you travel to has at least one thing in common: the cops. The uniforms, the gear, the look, the tactics, the hierarchy, the cars, all of it. On every level, it's the same. Corporatized. Big business in policing. Well, not so much in training them, but certainly in arming them. Everywhere you go, cops are the same. Now, on one hand, these certain similarities are a beacon in a storm. When you're in need of police, you can spot them easily, even if you're an out-of-towner. Unless, of course, they're in a completely unmarked car stalking their prey like predators. But they don't do that, because the police are protectors and not predators. The next 2 episodes are about the police. In the next episode, I'll dig deep into why we the people just let the cops do whatever they want. But in this episode, it's all about why all cops are bad, and why we constitutionally shouldn't even have police in the first place. They're a business on the taxpayer dime. We the people socialize this drain on our society, while we could be funding education so we wouldn't need this kind of police force anymore. We keep burning books and cash, throwing down more and more tax dollars so we feel safe from... This episode is about the great gaslighting of we the people to convince us that every community in this country needs a cookie-cutter, corporatized, and militarized police force, carbon copy state troopers, and, pardon the pun, uniform acceptance of their definition and standard of law and order and justice. This episode is about how we got brainwashed and why. It's about understanding that while we're all pissed off about that speeding ticket, we ignore the flagrant, inhumane, unconstitutional injustices committed in our own communities by men and women sworn and paid, but certainly not trained, to protect and serve. These 2 episodes are about the origins of our core values: safety, security, protection, peace, justice, patriotism, and pride, and how they've been tied to the police. How we've been manipulated by media, deliberate or not, consuming cop shows at our buffet table without the proper context of the other side. Wasn't it their guy who said there were good people on both sides? Just not when one side is a cop and another is a black guy on the ground struggling to catch a breath. This one, folks, really is about color. It's about black and white. It's about how we got bless y'all's hearts and all shucks into believing the police weren't out there hunting humans, promoting poverty, and lording over their fellow citizens while licking that fascist boot of oppression. Or how we've come to believe the police are our community comrades here to protect and serve, or the wild guns a-blazing lunatic consumed with authority. This topic breaks my little southern heart because I have to call out one of my favorite things and expose its wholesome escapism for what it truly was: brainwashing an audience to ignore the truth just like we would everything else. And just so we would like the police. And welcome to the podcast. When I was a child left unattended, I committed a crime. It's time to confess here because it's the right thing to do. I do not recall the date or time or even the year clearly. All I know is that I'm an outlaw, a criminal, and I've been running from this my entire life. This is my confession. In the 1980s, my father owned a flooring store. When I would go to work with him around 9 or 10 years old, my brother, now deceased, would let me tag along on his hijinks and shenanigans. He was 5 years my senior and my idol. Next door to this carpet store was a gas station that had an arcade in the back with digital slot machines, pinball, an assortment of video games, and vending machines with candy and toys. It's a kid's nirvana. My dad was like that big dog in the old Looney Tunes cartoon, Spike, and I was the little yappy dog, but hardly butch. I'd ask for money like that little yappy dog, and my dad would whap me aside with a, "Shut up!" My brother taught me how to do this, but I can't blame the dead who aren't here to defend themselves or the truth. He may have shown me, but I continued doing this on my own. This is my shame. So my dad got this fancy new copy machine back when that sort of thing was innovative. It printed front and back copies of documents. It even auto-fed the paper so you didn't have to do anything but turn the document over on the glass screen. Long story short, through trial and error, we discovered that the slightly thicker resume paper-ish letterhead Dad ordered made the dollar bills we would copy feel more like actual dollar bills and not copy paper. In full disclosure, we couldn't have done this for more than $50 at the very most. I'm exaggerating on that. I really only remember 3 or 4 times doing it total, so I'm accounting for what my brother may have done without me too. $25, really, if I'm guessing, because I know there were some 5s involved, but it worked. They went right in. It was early change machine tech from the mid-'80s, friends. Within months, it no longer worked. I guess we weren't the only ones in the country with that bright idea, because the machine started to reject the fake dollars. But alas, we wouldn't ride the end of that wave. The real stupidity was that the store clerk was already on to us. Criminals returned to the scene of the crime, right? So, of course, we didn't consider that. The owner of the joint was, at some point, going to crack open that box and count his dollars and see black and white, well, cream-colored dollars instead of green dollars. This is why, before the age of the internet, we were safe from the threat of being overthrown by the children. Well, up until now, kids lacked the sufficient worldview and experience to topple the patriarchy. We were dumb kids living in the moment. We didn't think it through. I'm not even sure we realized we were stealing or counterfeiting money. We certainly didn't understand the gravity of that at 14 and 9. But ignorance of the law isn't innocence, is it? We knew what we were doing was wrong. We were bored and wanted to play. Who even remembers what games were in that arcade now? We went in and tried to use that machine, and it didn't take long for the clerk to see us struggling. There was a straight eye line from the register to the change machine in the back. And we weren't geniuses. Yet. We were caught. Cream-handed. We cashed in our chips for small change, and here we were, guilty, and there was no escaping the consequences. When the police arrived, we weren't even being disruptive. We were cooperative. Still, the police took me and my brother, threw us to the ground, cuffed us, and then one of the officers knelt on my brother's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds while he was trying to say over and over, "I can't breathe." But they wouldn't let him up. I'm sorry, that didn't happen. Well, the first part did, to me and my brother. We did get caught, except there were no police called, there was no scuffle. Our dad was called, and he came and got us and scuffled with us in private after. The last part happened on May 25th, 2020, as the COVID pandemic was well in its swell. As a man about my age walked into a store and bought something, the clerk suspected they were handed a counterfeit 20. In fairness, I don't use much cash and pay little attention even with my experience. It's entirely possible that I wouldn't even know if I had a counterfeit 20 handed off to me in a random transaction where someone else didn't know any better. That, of course, seems like a logical default assumption to make in any case, right? Still, the store clerk, under the given circumstances, called the police. That day in Minneapolis, Minnesota, George Floyd was brutally murdered by police. He sure as hell wasn't the first. He sure as hell wasn't the last. Many in this country are fighting to ensure fewer and fewer fall. With those tragic events of that day, many more people like me, realize there is a much bigger issue in America that goes deeper than just saying white supremacy or even insisting Black Lives Matter. In fact, what we saw out of the firestorm frenzy backlash over the police's deliberate and inhumane murdering of George Floyd were the generational echoes of rage, anger, and depression, compressed over centuries. What America experienced was the dog whistling of that racial pressure cooker that had been boiling on high for over 500 years. As I've covered in earlier episodes, slavery was not exclusive to America or even Caucasian earth dwellers. We were just one of the last to cease its practice and one of the last to admit our fault. I say that because most others have, and we're still pretending Africans were brought here for their own good, and look at them now. They're converted Christians, so it worked, right? A vast majority of the culture that descended from slaves have embraced the religion that imprisoned them. And now many descendants of America's labor backbone worship the so-called God in whose name their ancestors were exploited, enslaved, abused, and murdered. What more validation does a white supremacist need, after all? America still practices slavery and has attempted to enslave others since being told we couldn't enslave some. When we were told we couldn't enslave specific people, America set out to enslave almost every other group until we were told one by one we couldn't do that anymore either. That's inflation, folks, the high labor overhead. So as long as there's been an unfair power dynamic, work that needed to be done, and lazy, good-for-nothing sociopaths, there has been slavery. Like it or not, the worst of our natures are natural and will grow and spread like a cancer if not pushed into social unacceptability. Meaning civilizations and cultures since the dawn of man have been working through trial and error, deep and critical thinking, philosophy and reason, to understand the human condition enough to enact social and civil guidelines to which we all adhere, understanding that without those guidelines, there's surely chaos. These are called rules or laws. The goal here is to make sure these rules or laws are devised fairly across the board and with a greater good as the end result, so that it's easier for everyone to bowl that ball straight down the center of the lane, leading to a perfect strike every time. Do the right thing. And if everybody does, if everybody's avoiding the gutter and bowling strikes straight down the middle, imagine what we could accomplish, right? No, we chose to be turkeys, but just not on the scorecard, you know? You don't want anyone falling into the gutter. That's not good for anyone or the community as a whole. So we set up these gutter guards, our most basic laws, those I spoke about in Deconstructing a Deity, the practical laws in our spiritual or religious tenets, the thou shalt not lie, cheat, steal, kill, etc., the 7 deadlies and whatnot. When those are generally accepted and respected by all, or at least a whopping majority, we can then accommodate for those social outliers. What are the consequences in our community that we all agree to for violating these basic gutter guard laws? Then we can begin to see how the community responds and coexists, fine-tuning those guidelines and rules so as not to infringe upon anyone's basic rights, but that within preserving those liberties, how can we craft a society that stays on task and doesn't cause chaos? That's when speed limits, rules about what you can and can't do in public, trade rules and regulations, or things like Wild West versus civilized society debates come into play. Do we want savagery or do we want evolution? Savage, civilized. Now, those are words that bring up some racially problematic feelings for many. Why? They're words with definitions, but they've been used as slurs for much of the last several hundred years. So much so that even saying them in context makes us feel problematic. Coming up in the episodes following this 2-parter about the police, I'm going to be touching on this topic, the words and labels we use and how they divide us when they should unite us. People who think bad things about other people create the words and the worlds that separate them from the people they see as less than or unworthy. It's up to you to decide if those people who think bad things about other human beings are bad or something else. Those are the social outliers that have been socially normalized today. However, in earlier civilizations, it was difficult for these types to coexist in a community of that nature. For some, not all, a swift kick in their compassion ignites their empathy and emotions emit. They begin to see the errors of their ways. For others, well, some people need to experience the oppression they inflict on others, worse treatment, to understand the gravity of their actions. In many cases throughout the history of humankind, ostracization, exile, or isolation has been the long-held, tried-and-true solution. For that, communities created jails. If one cannot act like a human, one gets caged like an animal until such time one can prove again one can act like a human around other humans. And boy, isn't that problematic. But consider this, from Bronze Age thinking more than modern era. I'm talking about how civilizations formed and what those early people learned that stood the test of time and made its way to us. Biblical era people and before that, cavemen. These are early man's ideas of justice. Consequence for actions or ideas. When one acts in a way, talks in a way, or thinks in a way that endangers others, themselves, or the community, actions should be taken to keep everyone safe, correct? If your child says they wonder what would happen if they stuck the fork in the power outlet, you not only tell the kid why that's a terrible idea, but then you find a way to hide the forks and cover the power outlets, right? Or do you wait until the kid actually does it, or says that to someone else so they get the idea to try it, or just hope they take your word for it and it never comes up in their mind again? The power dynamics of a people are such that human nature infects this idea of personal policing or protection of the greater community. We crave punishment more than justice, lust over law. We want to tickle our lizard brains to watch someone else suffer. Because after all, they made someone suffer. This isn't altogether bad for a society. It can be somewhat cathartic in some cases. Gladiator pits, Daniel in the lion's den, Jabba's rancor pit. That was an early idea civilizations had of throwing the people a bone to satisfy that primitive bloodlust, one of the last holdovers of our pre-evolved selves. Spoilers. I'm arguing this trait, the bloodlust and thirst for revenge, it's one of the traits that hinders our advancement as a species. That bloodlust is real and we can see it if we choose every major news cycle. Wars, mass shootings, police brutality, the schadenfreude of getting what someone deserves. Even if it's a billionaire dying a horrific death with their son in experimental underwater adventures. Even if that billionaire's arrogance is the cause of the accident. We all experience this feeling in some manner, whether you'll admit it or not. But it's a low-hanging fruit. All it does is feed that lizard brain, and then that lizard brain craves more of that sweet revenge like any other sugary treat. And like any other sugary treat, it just feeds cancer. The harder thing is to study the criminal and understand why they did what they did, then create solutions for others who might be similarly damaged or tempted, and then protections for any potential victims. The harder thing is to understand. The harder thing when faced with a horrible situation is to show compassion for the offender and the victim simultaneously. Anyway, we're too black and white for that, aren't we? The harder thing has always been to turn the other cheek. Forgiveness. That doesn't jibe with justice, though, does it? Not in our current form. Today, forgiveness, that holy tenet of Christianity and many other spiritualities, is forgotten in the courtroom. Today, there is no forgiving our debts as we forgive our debtors. Thy will be paying that off till thou diest. This day, there is no giving another their daily bread. If you can't pay for it, you don't deserve to eat. Today, we aren't led into temptation. We're born into it, baptized into it, and delivered to evil, for the kingdom and the power and the glory of the wealthy. Amen. Power dynamics. We're going to be discussing that a lot this season because that's where it all goes wrong for us. Every time, ideas like supremacy, superiority, defending the lie that in America, all men are created equal. We're lying lie faces and our slacks are smoldering, friends. Somewhere along the way in human history, we, the sapient species, somehow sold our souls when we determined that things like race or geography were our greatest dividing factors. When we began looking more at how different someone looks, talks, prays, or lives than how differently they feel or think. You see, those are the dividing lines between us. Intelligence. Intellectual, academic, emotional. All people are not created equal. Then life processes us to be more unequal. That's why equity is superior to equality. However, it's impossible to fathom an equitable society without a sense of equality. So let's take a look at my Bronze Era community example, then through the lens of American ideals. The hypothetical jail or banishing of the social outlier makes sense. When a people commune together, creating a society, forming a culture, what does that look like? You take the able and put them to work for the good of the community. You take the less capable and find ways they can contribute to the community. You take those who can't and you do for them. You find the best and most skilled people, put them to positions where they can thrive for the sake of the community. You take the smartest and you make them leaders and teachers. You take the strongest and you make them workers, builders, and warriors. You take the healers, you make them healers. As that society grows, evolves, there's less need for a people to be put in the positions of their natural abilities. Those people begin exploring talents outside of their natural gifts. Some farmers might entertain the community over the night fire. Some leaders might also cook. Some warriors might also heal. A builder might take time from building structures to carving toys for children. But utopia never exists. Someone wants more. Someone always wants more. Cain and Abel. So what does a society do with someone who steps out of bounds? Pragmatically speaking, lock them up, put them in a corner, time out. If they learn their lesson, give them a second chance. If they mess up again, what next? Who determines guilt and innocence? Who decides their punishment? The trials and errors of Early humankind. Well, the community decides. It's early democracy. Everyone has a say, right? I mean, before governments were formed, how did early civilizations coexist? What was fair and just, naturally, instinctively? Imagine if the community decided to let someone be in charge, or maybe a group of individuals. Well, if those people were pragmatic representatives of all the people in the community and wouldn't bring in their personal opinions or agendas into their decision-making, that's kind of ideal, right? What if someone doesn't like that their brother got into an argument with someone, lost his temper, and got exiled? That maybe that person might push the community to simplify their community decisions by forming a group or a committee or a panel of the influential leaders of the community. The farmiest farmer, the buildiest builder, they all gather and make the decisions for everyone so that the people can go about their business. And the people go about their business, being told what to do. Not so much because they want to have no say, but because they're pushed out of the decision-making process so the rules can be changed. People shouldn't be exiled just for cracking somebody over the skull with a rock, right? Brother is brought back, forgive and forget, and cracking someone over the head is a new standard outlier norm. After all, you're not getting exiled over it, are you? Maybe they'll just put you in jail for a while. Maybe your brother will get you out. Let's Americanize this community. Imagine that same Bronze Age society had strong warriors, farmers, builders, and all that, but one of their explorers came back with a man who looked way different than they did, and boy, could he outwork them all. He could build better, lift more, carry more, fight harder. He knew how to farm. He just couldn't communicate because they spoke different languages. Well, that community would see how that man worked and might think if only we could find more like him. But they didn't see this as a man. They saw him as a means to an end. So within a short period of time, more and more of these explorers are rewarded for exploring, and many more of these explorers find many more of these different people and bring them back to the community so that the community can grow and thrive faster than they ever imagined. Somewhere along the way, some of the people in the community who once had a purpose in that community see new different people doing their things and doing them better, but also see that these people are pretty much only doing the work, and then they're going to these other living quarters close to the jail on the outskirts of the community. And that some of the warriors have been tasked to follow these different workers so none of them get lost along the way, escorting them from their living quarters to their jobs and back. Once some people start seeing that these warriors who escort the workers are also some of the warriors exploring and finding more of these workers lost in the wild with nothing to do, they realize that maybe the wars the warriors are fighting were solely to get more workers. So some people start asking, why do we treat the workers like animals when they seem like people just like we are? Well, then laws get passed and enacted in that community by the heads of their respective divisions to say that those people questioning things, well, look, see, legally you're wrong. Those aren't people, they're the property of the community. Well, they're technically the property of the representatives of the community. Like the farm master owns all the farmers, the build master owns all the builders, the cook master owns all the cooks, the hunt master owns all the hunters, etc. And the people of that community just all collectively looked at each other and said, okay, good enough, until it wasn't anymore. For most of us, that anymore has come at different intervals. Most recently in the modern era, anymore came on May 25th, 2020. So where do we get these ideas of our current form of policing? How do we all just allow this abhorrent monstrosity that is the current police force in America? We just allow them to exist and behave however they want without any consequence. Look at the laws in place to protect law enforcement officers from civil and legal recourse. Go look at the cases that are handled internally within the police union that don't even make the news. Look, I'm a union guy, all right? You ask me, people are corrupt. The idea of unions is excellent. The protections offered are imperative to any workplace for the workers. We've seen that with shows like The Office, The Morning Show, every fucking workplace show, drama, movie, sitcom, our own real world experience. We have toxic work environments because we, the working class, don't have anyone in our corner fighting for our rights in Washington or our workplaces. The police union is something different. It's very much in Washington, and it's often an entity there to protect the employee more than the ethics, to seek justification more than justice, to build a culture of team loyalty over truth. Simply to say that my personal feelings on unions and workers' rights in the workplace do not include law enforcement. When law enforcement is held to the same standards as we the people, then, and only then, may law enforcement enjoy the same rights, liberties, freedoms, privilege, and personal peace that real people enjoy. Real people, I say, because what kind of person, chooses to put on that uniform every day? How could they? The history of our police in this country is alarming and disturbing. When I ask why we even have police, many aren't aware of the constitutionally problematic waters we're treading on. Fact is, Americans don't really know much about our rights and privileges guaranteed by our government. It was that government, by the way, which created the police. But how? How can America, from sea to shining sea, have the same police force everywhere you go? States' rights. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution is basically the catch-all cop-out amendment that says, today is going to be the day that they're going to throw it back to you, states. The powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states or to the people. So in this case, we have a separation of powers. It isn't legislative, judicial, or executive. This is federal, state, and individual. In short, it vaguely limits the power of the federal government in no specific terms, stating that the federal government lacks full authority, and if it doesn't have authority over something, any authority it doesn't have, it's assessed to the states or the individual, the people. But they didn't mean individual when they said the people. That's an abstract collective phrase that simply means those who aren't important enough to make the rules. In even shorter, if the states can limit the federal government's reach and then restrict the power of the people, then the state has ultimate power. Anti-federalism. Then the country is just a group of different states, united or not. It's more like Europe than America. Standard language, currency, and basic rights and privileges afforded to all, but then each individual state, country, territory sort of makes their own rules otherwise, except that Americans still kind of focus on that last part too much. The basic rights and privileges afforded to whom is the ongoing debate. That revolving door of dehumanization. My, how we've evolved. If it was in the Bronze Age, the people arguing that some people shouldn't have rights would be the ones jailed or exiled, not elected to lead. How do I know that? Anthropology and history mostly. But moreover, human civilization wouldn't have survived like this. There's nothing in the Constitution that guarantees the imposition of a police force on we the people. There's nothing to back up the idea that we have the kind of police we have, the way we have it today. In fact, the 10th Amendment, in this context, simply grants the power of the states, among other unnamed vague and nonspecific things, to keep the peace, maintain order, and ensure everyone abides by the given laws of the land. This is called police power, and it goes back to pre-American Caucasian European roots. The police power is rooted in what the government or monarchy could and couldn't do to its peoples. It wasn't so much about the police as it was about policing a people to ensure peace and order, creating the laws as opposed to enforcing them. In this case, that police power was one of the other powers that fell under that 10th Amendment, handing that police power over to the states. An 1851 Massachusetts Supreme Court decision in Commonwealth v. Alger cemented the police power at the discretion of the state level. It was those states over the course of the 20th century that homogenized and corporatized and militarized each and every one of our local police forces in America. With the help, of course, to capitalism, commercialism, and the media to normalize cops, but we'll get to that a bit more in the next episode. Jacobson v. Massachusetts is a case you probably heard around the COVID pandemic because it was where the court upheld the authority of the states to enforce vaccination and laws regarding vaccinations. This case was a key building block in this whole topic because it reinforced the earlier Alger decision that police power of the state could be used to usurp individual liberties in certain cases. Certain clearly defined in Jacobson, but not clearly defined in legal precedent. That precedent could be used to enforce a state's police power to oppress, marginalize, or disadvantage, well, whomever the state felt like deserved it. Along with organized crime, prohibition, and other key legislation of the early 20th century, the legal landscape for Americans was changing, but not for all men. Boy, I bet at this point you're tired of everything being about white supremacy and class, huh? Well, this episode sure is. We can't discuss the police in America without discussing slave patrol. No, that isn't colonial American children's animated television programming. Slave patrols were America's unofficial, not so well-regulated militia and an early attempt at a police force. Many might be familiar with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act from middle school. Or high school? We'll come back to that one in a moment. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was the first of the bounty hunting legislation in America that hindered the rights and freedoms of Americans consensually immigrated or non-consensually immigrated. Okay, it may not have been the first, but it was the first of this act. This act said that a federal or circuit judge or any state magistrate could have the immediate and final say on whether an alleged fugitive slave was free or in fact a slave. No trial, no evidence, just go before the country judge and the judge decides. Sounds fair, right? Mighty Mayberry and Boss Hogg of you. It was this act that bred the Underground Railroad. Then, as more and more pressure from actual humans was applied on the sociopathic South, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed. I mean, nearly 60 years of rural country judges deciding the fates of countless humans, and we finally get an update. Thankfully. Right? Wrong. Instead of righting the wrongs in the 1793 Act, 1850 doubled down, with accused fugitive slaves not being allowed to testify on their own behalf, nor were they allowed a jury trial at all. Here's where it gets choppy, though. Back then, federal marshals acted as glorified bounty hunters, mercenaries for hire. Slaves were property, and property cost money and made slave owners money. So rewards were issued many times. Can't find a job? Go human hunting. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act slapped huge fines on marshals caught not enforcing the law, and even worse, if they were caught helping fugitives escape. Penalties for anyone caught helping free these human beings from the daily beatings, mistreatment, and oppression by white supremacist, narcissistic sociopaths feeding on greed. The 1793 Act drove more to activism with the Underground Railroad. The 1850 Act created more abolitionists and made more and more people very angry. This ignited a firestorm of Northern legislation to counter the South's inhumanity. Those laws, by the way, the North's counter laws to the sociopathic South's insanity and inhumanity, were the laws that sparked the Civil War. Remember? The war over states' rights. Well, it was about slavery, because when the Northern states exacted their rights to pass laws that weren't as inhumane and countered the South's abusive, savage, uncivilized legislation, effectively calling out the South for what they were, sociopaths, the South went into a narcissistic spiral and seceded. The abolitionists said, hey, these are people, and the slavers said, the fuck they are. It's as simple as that. In 1864, those acts would finally be repealed. The damage done by them hasn't been undone by America. What bred out of all this nearly 3/4 of a century and 3 to 4 generations of Americans was the inhumane normalization of dehumanization, demonization, and deliberate abuses against other human beings. The fact is that the laws and legislation enacted by our government, federal or state, North or South, have been detrimental and damning to our society. The well-regulated militia part of the Second Amendment gets tricky here because that was intended to be America's civil defense. We, the people, coming together to defend our land from, well, intruders, of course. Intruders like we were when we came and stole this already inhabited land we discovered. Spain technically through Columbus's fouled-up path, but bygones, am I right? Now, it was said to prevent a corrupt government from treading on us, and that we, the people, should have the right to defend ourselves and property from that oppressive, corrupt government because many who fled here fled oppressive regimes. Many of the earliest pilgrims were cultists who were ostracized by their communities in Europe for their disgusting and socially unacceptable behaviors. The kind of things Donald Trump would say openly and proudly about his own daughter hundreds of years later, for example, look into it. In fact, let's discuss the Salem witch trials as less about exorcising supernatural boogie women and more one of silencing sexual assault victims, and see how different our history looks. History is written by the victors, not the victims. These local militias patrolling about, making sure no livestock or other property is on the loose. If they find one, they might not even return that slave to its former place if they couldn't determine ownership from the branding. That's right, you did know slave owners branded their livestock, even slaves. That's how not human the sociopathic Southern slave owners were. They wouldn't view them as humans, but would use them as sex slaves. Now put that in your Cracker Barrel and prey on it. That should tell us everything we know about these people. These people. But when someone hears Black Lives Matter and their response is, no, all lives matter, or worse, Blue Lives Matter, you know what they are. You may not want to admit it, but you know. Because as you'll learn by the end of this two-parter, we've been brainwashed, manipulated, and gaslit to normalize law enforcement. But the ethics of right and wrong aren't as fluid and aren't for entertainment purposes only. Right and wrong rarely has as much to do with law and order and certainly less to do with justice in America. Back to that well-regulated militia. As I mentioned before about the Second Amendment's original intent being to prevent intruders or being tread on by a corrupt government, in light of what we know of the Fugitive Slave Acts now, we also know it was to protect us from non-consensual intruders, slaves. America's first real version of a police force were for hunting slaves. These slave patrol militias were terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, except the Klan bred after the Civil War out of the social friction of the emancipation of the slaves and the humiliating, absolute ass-whooping the South took. These groups, the slave patrols, were insidious because they were the norm and they were normalized. They were accepted, and thanks to the validation and legislation, they had the rule of the land. They could go where they wanted, and if you got in their way, you got punished. They didn't need warrants. The guns? That Second Amendment? It was simply about two things: protection and terror. Freedom to protect our land, ourselves, our families, while terrorizing literally any and everyone around us with this killing machine we're carrying. In the case of early America, the terror was felt by the indigenous and the slaves, fearful that a dozen white men on horses with pistols and rifles aplenty would hunt you down, and you'd better hope they shot you when you got caught. Well, not a lot different than today's modern cops now, huh? Except it's a completely unmarked car instead of a horse. That's right, I said pretty much the Klan were the early cops. Not the Klan, but specifically groups like what would become the Klan later on. But in fact, the KKK formed as a group of musicians trying to get laid by playing music. But the more their communities gathered, those picking and grinning around the campfire gatherings grew and grew, and those campfires grew to bonfires. And then somebody says, "Hold my bear, watch this." And they go terrorize and torment now freed slaves, starting a bonfire on the lawn. Those slave patrol groups that hunted humans before and during the Civil War were transitioned to groups set out in their communities to prevent the now emancipated, non-consensual African immigrants from getting too close to the white people. If you won't work for free in America, you're worthless, right? After the Fugitive Slave Acts and the Civil War-era black codes were abolished with the 14th Amendment in 1868, America's next phase of police during Reconstruction were more like Jim Crow patrols, pushing the segregation, division, and harassment of blacks in America, keeping them in their place, making sure they lived in fear every day of their lives. What these groups did was brutal and inhumane, but not an American tradition. Spanish slavers, Dutch slavers, among the world's first in the modern slave trade, practiced many inhumane tactics that influenced what would become how America would define acceptable behavior against other human beings, even and especially by police. What is police? The roots of the word are more related to governing a people than oppressing or holding dominion over them. The idea of police, etymologically, using the historical origins of the word, is that the government should ensure its people practice good citizenship. That sounds like police. That sounds like what we have, in theory. But the fact is, the roots of America's modern police ideology have more to do with British monarchy and civilian class resistance than any early Roman, Greek, or less toxic influence. Think about that, please. We came here to America to escape the oppressive overreach of the psychotic King of England, whichever one we want to choose. Then we get here, break free, and then just do what they did? The police in England were loyal to the king above all else. They were the king's horses and all the king's men who couldn't resist an omelet. The monarchy utilized constables, members of the royal court, to be the community peacekeepers and authority of civil obedience. It was regular practice for that constable to summon watchmen, eligible males in the community who would accompany the constable or simply serve as unofficial constables on their own watch, who would call for the proper constable to come aid when they found an infraction. These watchmen were the tattletales and snitches of the community. They got no stitches, though. They were the fascist bootlicking sellouts, class traitors if ever there were. They'd see a violation of the king's rule and shout, "Citizens arrest!" like Gomer Pyle sworn in from the filling station on his way to boot camp. And believe me when I say, these watchmen were often the Gomers and Goobers of their respected communities. The constables, they as Barney gets. Often, the privileged males of the community would find someone less privileged to take their watch, leaving the watch to be mostly stacked with the least qualified, least educated, least trained, and most desperate among the community. Well, they were often too old to work, like Walmart greeters as cops, or younger poor people, maybe even disabled or discharged former soldiers for the king. Today in America, we distanced ourselves from the king's men and the classism associated with lording over the monarchy's subjects. In America, we fought hard not to have to do things that way anymore. So today in America, we have the sheriff and their deputies, and literally any eligible person can be a deputy with little training. Except America's police are primarily here to protect wealthy people's property. But I mean, it isn't like America's cops work for the 1%, right? Wrong again. It's a fact that most cities in America by Reconstruction had wealthy people, businessmen, capitalists, politicians, and those who didn't work for a living, seeing those who were working for a living outnumbering them exponentially. What they saw in their factories and companies was what Southern plantation owners saw when they looked out the window. Hundreds of employees that had no chance of being happy, and they had no chance of keeping them happy enough not to revolt. So when you're unwilling to give the workers more than the bare minimum, you gotta have an army to keep them in line, working. So in every major city where people worked and rich people watched them work, police forces popped up all over, and they all started looking and operating the same. Almost as if this was some huge company called Police Corp, and anytime a new town was started, they called Police Corp to come install the police. We took what didn't work in Britain and made it worse here. Jill Lepore points out in a 2020 New Yorker article that chicken and egging who influenced who regarding England, America, and the police is a tricky historical rabbit hole to follow. Cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia all had watches as colonies under British rule. In 1705, Lepore states, Philadelphia's governor felt like militias could keep the city safer than the currently established watch, but that militias were here to serve the common defense, be it natives, intruders, or slave uprisings, not to police the king's subjects. From historical figures like Jeremy Bentham to Patrick Colquhoun, the idea that police keep the peace in the streets while justice is served in the courts was held up even today, with protest chants of "no justice, no peace," which we began hearing a lot in the summer of 2020 following George Floyd's brutal murder by the Minneapolis police. America's well-regulated militia by the Second Amendment should be abolished if we were civilized. However, that wouldn't sell the NRA more guns, now would it? The systematic racism, the white supremacy of America has a foundation, and it has a big blue stripe down the middle of that black and white American flag. So if it's this clear that America's police are the problem and that the modern iteration of America's police force is unconstitutional, but who in their right mind would challenge that? Then how can so many people support the police? With donations, with ideas, with votes. I mean, with everything we know of what the police stand for today and what they've always stood for, how on earth can anyone justify backing them? Well, for that handy-dandy bit of gaslighting and brainwashing, we have to examine the black and white of Back the Blue. In the early 20th century, a man named August Vollmer revolutionized police forces with a philosophy that incorporated the social sciences like psychology and social work into the protect and serve duties. Vollmer was the head of the police department in Berkeley, California, taking that job over in 1905, and immediately forced every employee to resign. He then replaced them with college-educated people. August Vollmer wanted to create the kind of society that negated the need for police the way we have it today. He criticized police departments of the time to be corrupt and prone to inhumane brutality. He identified how vulnerable they were to political interference and sway. Vollmer was quoted as saying that his preference would be an officer never having to make an arrest at all. He established the first police training academy. Vollmer is considered the father of modern policing, by a system that completely ignores his views on modern policing. In full fairness, racially, Vollmer was problematic at best. His stance on the philosophy of policing notwithstanding, his vision of a police force in reality is more the forefather of today's militarized and corporatized cookie-cutter police force. Flash forward a couple of decades, with Prohibition in full swing, mobsters, the hard crash from the Roaring '20s to the Great Depression, people were desperate. Law enforcement in America took a drastic turn as the mentally unhinged, narcissistic sociopath J. Edgar Hoover stepped in and began a stop and frisk, throw him to the ground, shake the testimony out of him style of policing. Almost like giving the cops a 007 and a PR department. Where Vollmer valued education, Hoover relied on training. There's a big difference in those words. It's very similar to character dynamics on a TV show. As we'll discuss more in our next episode, our collective ideals regarding police, policing, law, order, and justice have been skewed mostly by entertainment media more than anything else. Then American culture mixing our sense of patriotism in with police, almost admitting they're military, has compromised our objectivity, the numbing down. But then the assault on public education over the decades and the floodgates of 24/7, never-ending buffet of infotainment media have served to dumb us down. Then we're just in the gladiator pits again, frothing at the mouth over who had it coming, who got what they deserved, and American supersized schadenfreude. But our true collective ideals regarding police, policing, law, order, and justice don't really align with my Bronze Age example or America's early slave patrols, or even our current system. In fact, if one could be pragmatic and put away things like religion and what their coach didn't teach them in social studies, we might find that most people in America truly do believe similar ways regarding these principles, deep down. It's that we've been swayed in extremes through extreme examples, extreme language, by extremists. Sounds extreme, huh? Well, these ideals are more than words, and my message is wholehearted. Summarizing this point seems daunting, but the left's inept branding and marketing brought us defund the police amidst protests and riots breaking out in streets over the corrupt police. That should tell you where the Democrats stand on policing. One might think their intent was to say they wanted to defund the police, when in fact, they just wanted the support of saying it without having to do it. Offer the idea with terrible branding and people will be so consumed with the opposition's cries, you won't actually have to do anything. In fact, defunding the police isn't the answer. I'm not convinced abolishing the police would work overnight. Perhaps a reimagining of law enforcement and our court system for starters. How often have we reevaluated the way we did things 250 years ago? It seems August Vollmer and Sheriff Andy Taylor's view of the police offers more successful outcomes than the cartoonish J. Edgar Hoover and Barney Fife ideals. It would seem some cops need to respond in service and some cops need to show up to protect. Maybe these two forces shouldn't be one and the same. Maybe that's too much responsibility for one untrained law enforcement officer. How does one play both good cop and bad cop? It seems when one tries, it just turns out bad. Why? Because all the good in the world doesn't counter the bad acts one does, compromising one's ethics, morals, integrity, or humanity. This is why I say all cops are bad. Not bastards. Some are bastards. Some are police. All are bad. Why? Because they don't deserve to be there. None of them earned the right to hold dominion over you, their fellow Americans. None of them are qualified to do so, not by our current standards, and we need new standards at that. With no constitutional guarantee that we must have this kind of police, our states have failed us in this states' rights circus sideshow. We've been exploited and taken advantage of, just as with the potential slave uprisings being the reason for the Second Amendment and potential slave escapes being the founding reason of America's police. When the camera is shifted a bit from race to class, we see that in arming the citizens to oppress the non-consensually immigrated Africans, the government had built an army and armed them of the working class, of those who the wealthy were keeping as slaves, just at insultingly low wages. So how does one control their now well-armed but completely unregulated militia? A militarized, corporatized, and body-armored, well-regulated militia. Police force. I mean, go organize your people, all right? Go on strike, see what happens. We've seen it over and over. The 1970s hard hat riot following student protests, following Kent State, for just one example. So let's all forsake the mass prophets of America's injustice system and together quote the true prophets of the 20th century, the NWA, when we say together, fuck the police. Coming up, the ideas that form our most foundational principles and values come from somewhere, and we often don't consider where. Even when we do, we often stop once we think we've got it figured out. Well, I can't stop overthinking everything, and when I started asking why does America see its law enforcement, courts, and justice system the way we do, we the people allow police in every city to look the same no matter what and act the same. And we know the toxic history and problematic past with law enforcement. Yet we still live each and every day not saying a word when they're hidden in completely unmarked cars, targeting their prey, cornering their quarry for a quota they swear doesn't exist. Right? We fail to take a proper gander at our propaganda, but instead just soak it in, binging on it in our recliners like Alex, eyes pried open, hours at a time until we just can't take it anymore. The headlines, the shows, the films, the music, they're all designed to trigger our emotions and influence the way we think. Sometimes for entertainment purposes only, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, sometimes to protect, sometimes to serve a sinister end. In part 2, I'm pulling up to the filling station for a bottle of ice-cold pop culture and airing up our tired old narratives of cops and examining how we see cops as benevolent public servants or bumbling clowns. If our true core collective ideals regarding police, policing, law, order, and justice aren't reflective of what we have today, then how on earth did we let this happen? We laughed along as it was done to us, every Monday evening in prime time for almost a decade. Then every day throughout the day in syndication, then forever and ever 24/7 in the age of streaming. On-demand brainwashing to wet your whistle with some southern twang. Yeah, this one's gonna hurt. I have to overthink one of my favorite things, but it's all about color and how the world changed again in 1964, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, a compassion and critical thinking workbook, is on Amazon, and you can find everything I do there. Link to it through joshbrandonmedia.com. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find all my original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, and clips of my acting and voiceover work organized in playlists for your convenience. You can check out my merch store and get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. I've got bumper stickers, more products, always coming soon. You can follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Please do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. You grow with me. If you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App. It's my full-time job, you know. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.